Hi, I'm John, and welcome to Edgetone Studios. This is the MioXM from iConnectivity. Is this the answer to all your MIDI woes? So when I started building the studio, I was in the design process and thinking about what I was going to do with my keyboards. I had a couple keyboards. I was looking for some more vintage ones. I had thought that I might rack mount keyboards and go that route, but I found it very difficult to find vintage rack mount units versus full keyboard size systems. So I was trying to figure out how I was going to lay out the studio and still be able to MIDI connect all of my keyboards. And as you can see, my keyboards are here at the back of the control room. And way over there at the front of the control room is my mixing desk. And there are keyboards in the other corner. And I have Stage Vintage in the tracking room as well as a Hydrosynth at the moment. And I was looking for a way to get MIDI to run a longer distance than what's specified by the protocol. With regular MIDI DIN cables, you can run them about 20 feet. And my control room's at least 20 feet or about 20 feet front to back. And then I had to get to the corners. In my case, I did conduit under the floor and then go up through the walls and to the back. And with USB, you can get up to 15 feet depending on the USB type you use. USB 1 and USB 2 and USB 3 all have different specs, although you don't get any more benefit really over going anything above USB 1 for MIDI. So I did some research online, and that's when I came across the MioXM and this company called iConnectivity out of Canada here. And I was kind of happy they were a Canadian company. I like to support local where I can. And they make another product, the XL, which has a lot more MIDI ports. In my case, I was needing fewer ports, but in more locations, so I bought multiple units. Um, and what this does, it allows you to send MIDI over Ethernet. So you can send it over a network cable. If your network cable is connected to a Wi-Fi device or Wi-Fi router, and your computer is Wi-Fi enabled, or a laptop that's Wi-Fi enabled, you can go MIDI over Wi-Fi to your devices, both directions. And it comes with two DIN ports on the front, in and out for port 1, and then 6 more on the back to give you 4 MIDI DIN connections. It also has 4 USB ports, which allow for 4 USB connected MIDI devices. It's got a network jack at the front, a USB connection to connect to the computer for initial setup, but also if you wanted, you don't have to use this as a network device. You could simply use it as a USB MIDI interface for your computer. And the only thing else on it is a power on and off button that also works as a toggle to go between 4 different presets for different routing. So there's not a lot to show physically other than the unit itself. So let's switch over to the computer and I'll show you a little bit about how it's set up and what you can do with it. Okay, so here I am back at my desk and I've fired up the software we use to configure this. This is something you download from iConnectivity site. It's called Oracle for X Series, and it allows you to program your MioXMs. And I've got the one I'm setting up plugged in, USB cable, and simply powered on. The little lights come up there. The device is pretty straightforward. Button to power it on, same button you hold it down to power it off, and you watch the lights go backwards and shut off. And the same button you use to switch between 4 different memory locations. And there it is showing up as the MioXM 0EF, which I guess is part of the serial number. So I just put a little sticker on mine to show which one's which. So when you first go in, you can go into this information box and you see there's a factory reset. That's how I reset this so I could show you how it works. The serial number, hardware version, and a firmware version. You can clear the MIDI settings, reboot the device here. Somewhere in here is the naming. I will go through and see if I can remember where to set that. So as you click through, you can see there's MIDI routing. this filtering and remapping section, setting up presets, and this is where you name it. So you go into the preset section, you can rename the device. So this is my one that I keep in the tracking room, so I just call it the studio instead of the control room. Hit save. Now you can also go in here, you can now save this. This is a currently loaded preset 1, which means all the MIDI routing and mapping, which is default right now anyways, is under preset 1. You can save that to other locations. You could save it as a specific preset, and then you can load back presets, and then you can back up to a file here. And when you do that, you can select if you want to back up one of the presets or all of the presets. And if in the case, if I say all, I can give it a name and save it. So I've already saved my studio setup. So when I'm done this demonstration, I can just reload what I had before from that sysx file. This device is ready to be programmed. And if you want to use it as a network device, which is what I'm going to do, then you simply connect it into your network port and make sure your network port is connected to the same network your computer's on. And then when you launch this software, once again, it'll show up. So these two are showing up as though they're connected to the computer, but they're actually connected over Ethernet on the same network. This one is currently connected via USB. But for the moment, I'm going to take a break, go plug in the studio machine into the studio itself, plug in the Hydrasynth and the Korg SV1, and then we'll do some setups with that. So I decided to get fancy and set up a camera showing me setting up the MioXM in my tracking room. So I basically came in and plugged in the power cord and tried to reach the network cable and realized I couldn't quite get at the cables from this side. So I put it down and wandered over to the other side so you can watch me plug in some cables. Because, ooh, so fancy, so exciting. Look at the quality of this YouTube channel just going up. So here I am plugging in a USB connection into the Hydrasynth, and that's going into the innermost USB port on the device. That won't really matter, as you'll see. We'll force a connection to that specific port or host number once we get into the software. Then I track down which is the MIDI in DIN and plug that in, and the MIDI out DIN and plug that in. And once that was done, I got down and got the network connection connected, and then just found a way to set the unit on its side. Okay, now that that's set up, I've switched back to my full desktop here. Hopefully it's still visible. So now you see the MioXM Studio showing up. This is now connecting over the network. And if I go into the RTP MIDI setup, you'll see basically everything's set to be responder, connected computer. There's no actual connection made. And I can see that my IP address of this device is 192.168.2.117 and my subnet mask and the gateway. So it picked that up from my router. So now I'm connected, and a couple of things I'll show you here. Basically, I forgot to turn on the Hydrasynth and the Stage Vintage, so I'll go do that now. And there you can see the Hydrasynth showed up as a host, HST host 1. And is now USB connected to this device. So the USB over network connection allows MIDI over USB to go through the Ethernet and connect to the computer. It does not allow it to work as a full USB hub. You couldn't stick any other type of USB device over there like a camera. It's simply for MIDI devices. One of the problems you'll find if you don't set a reservation here onto a port, what will happen is every time that device boots up, if you have multiple USBs, they might get assigned to different host numbers. So let's say I had my OB6 connected there as well. The OB6 might come out as number 2 and the Hydrasynth as number 1, but the next time I boot, they might come the other way around, and then all your MIDI routings are mixed up. So over here, you can force it to always reserve host number 1. So USB host 1 is always a Hydrasynth. So I've set that now, and as I do the rest of the setup, we'll be not having to worry about things getting messed up. So there's a second component to setting up the Ethernet MIDI. On Windows, it's a little download called RTP MIDI. On Mac, you use your MIDI and audio devices set up to do the same sort of thing. It's got a similar functionality. So when I launch this little window here, you'll see a list of sessions and then various connectable ports on the MioXM devices. Now you can see I've already got the OB6, the Octopad, Polyevolver all set up on my other MioXMs. But in this case, we were looking at device, which one was it? E0EF. So you'll see MioXM 0EF 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way to 12. So that's the 4 MIDI ports, the 4 USB ports, and 4 more USB ports. And you're thinking, well, how do you have 4 more USB ports? Well, if you add a little USB hub onto one of those USB ports, you can get up to 4 more devices. So really, you could have 12 MIDI devices connected to each of these units. So the way I go about it is, if I want to create a new connection for my Hydrasynth, I go in here and hit plus. It creates a new device. It just named it the same as my computer name, Edgestone. I type it as Hydrasynth. You want a bonjour name that makes sense, and in this case, I will make it exactly the same as I've done on all of mine. And that's basically a protocol name for over the Ethernet to know what to talk to it as. And then down here, you figure out which port you're going to be connecting to. So we're on 0EF. And the trick is the first 4 ports on the MioXM are the MIDI over DIN connections. And so 1, 2, 3, 4 are DIN, and the 5 would be your first USB connection. So in my case, I've connected to the first USB connection. It'll be 5. I hit connect, and this thing comes up with a big question mark because it doesn't know what to connect to yet. I've defined that there's a Hydrasynth. Oh, maybe it will. Hit enabled. There we go. And it now shows up as connected to the MioXM. So basically, I've created a MIDI connection on my computer that connects over to that device and then routes through to the Hydrasynth. And if I go back into the RTP MIDI on this session, we should see that number 5, RTP 5, is now connected. Over here, it says the bonjour name of itself is the MioXM OEF05, and it's connected to my computer's IP address and defined as Hydrasynth. Okay, now that I've defined that MIDI connection to the MioXM, let's bring up MIDI aux, which is just a Windows utility that allows you to route MIDI around to different places. And I think I've already done this, but I go in and I set my Keylab MIDI controller, which is right in front of me on my desk down here. Can't see it on the camera. And I connect that to the Hydrasynth here and hit OK. And now when I play this keyboard, you should be able to hear the Hydrasynth coming through. So I'm triggering MIDI to the Hydrasynth. I have a connection showing up on my computer. It's basically the same as a locally connected USB MIDI device. It will show up in my DAW as a routable MIDI device, and I can start recording using that. I can send patch change commands. I can send any sort of sysx data. I can load patches. It's basically a device in a completely different room that is now connected to my computer. So going back into Oracle for X Series, let's do one more. We'll just do the stage vintage, same sort of thing. go into the RTP MIDI. I previously had defined the SV1, as you can see here, but it's no longer connected to anything because I had erased my factory reset my settings. So I've plugged the SV1 into the front DIN ports, which is number 1. So I just have to find the right MioXM device. There it is, 0EF01, and hit connect there. This one's already been enabled. You can see it connected right away. Latency is 0 milliseconds. This thing is incredibly fast. It's just as fast as direct MIDI connected devices. And when I go into my RTP MIDI, we'll now see number 1 is connected to the SV1. So, like I say, at that point in time, you're ready to go. You can start recording. You are all set up for remote connection. However, when you restart your computer, it may or may not automatically be connected depending on how your software is behaving. So there's something else you can do in here to set the settings. So by default, this is a responder. It's responding to the MioXM saying, hey, I'm here. I'm an SV1. Do you want to connect to me? So instead, you can change this to an initiator. And you can initiate by IP address, which is a bit more complicated because you have to note your address, or by name. So if I just type in here, I want to initiate a connection when this computer starts, or to the SV1, and say save. Takes a sec, and now it's connected to the SV1. That's the port over Ethernet. For the rest of these, if you don't want to use them, just click on this little blue box and you can basically make them not show up. That way you don't end up with a bunch of MIDI connections to nothing showing up in your software. So I'll turn all 12 of these off. And I forgot to set this up as an initiator, so hit save. And I should have a connection show up in a second. So the only way this wouldn't work is if you make a typo. It should work every single time. So that's basically it. That's your remote connectivity. If you were plugged in directly via USB instead of over the network, it works exactly the same. So you don't need to use this as a network attached device, but you can. And let me just show you a couple more things. If you need to update the firmware, it's very straightforward. Hit the firmware button. You have to be connected via USB. You can either load the latest from their website or choose the file that you've downloaded if you're trying to downgrade your firmware from a previous copy. And then this section here is where we get into some pretty crazy stuff. Once you've got your connection set up, and assuming you have multiple MioXM devices connected over a network, you can technically route any source to any destination. So in this case, my DIN 1, which is the Korg SV1, if I wanted that to always be connected to the Hydrasynth, which was host number 1 for the USB connected hosts, I could go in here and choose this as the I could type that, it's called the Hydrasynth, but I could go in and say it's connected to host 1 instead of DIN 1, right? So you can reroute what's coming in to what's going out in any direction. But beyond that, you could literally set up a connection between one MioXM source and another MioXM's destination. And once you pre-configured that, you could use that for live stage MIDI setups where you have keyboards on one side of the stage, keyboards on another side of the stage, and maybe you walk to one side of the stage and play things and it triggers things on the other side of the stage. Or it might be triggering rack-mounted gear that's backed by the sound board itself. All sorts of stuff. I don't use any of this. I just thought I'd show that there's possibilities there for those who are doing MIDI connections using, especially for live sound or stage setups. Once you've got it all set up, you can save your source files with a backup. So if your device ever fails, you could have a secondary one, reload the configuration, and be ready to go with your setup. And then secondly, there is this filtering section where you can go in and now filter what types of MIDI messages you want to allow or disallow from any of the ports. So if I don't want the stage vintage to respond to program changes on channel 1, but I do want it on the rest of the channels, I can just click there, and now I've filtered out the program change. You can filter out all sorts of MIDI commands, such as your stop commands, your start commands, program changes, channel pressure, pitch bends, or just filter out everything if you don't want. I don't want anything on channel 1 to come from my stage vintage 1. So again, incredibly powerful. I'm using it much more simply than that. It's really just a way for me to sit at my desk, program, play music using my hardware synthesizers, and record that direct through my mixing board. So I think I've covered most of it. I hope you found this interesting. Hopefully it's something that could help you with your MIDI setups. Is it going to help you with all your MIDI woes? Probably not. MIDI's a complex subject for setting up and configuring and making it work the way you want. But in terms of getting distant connectivity with MIDI over Ethernet, you can take that 15 foot of MIDI over USB, or that 20 foot of MIDI over DIN, and turn it into over 300 feet of MIDI over network, and do things like have large rooms with MIDI devices everywhere, or live sound setups. So hopefully you've enjoyed this. Thanks for watching.